Awesome, you made it back, and I'm glad you did, because we have a brand new episode of What's in the Shop, and I got some really great releases here. Some of my all-time faves, actually. Fave bands and fave releases. Let's not waste time. Let's get into it. I'm starting off with Ultravox and Vienna. This is their fourth album, but the first with Mitsouko, and the first to send Ultravox to superstardom. Really quick. In the late 70s, well, in the first three albums, Ultravox was headed by a guy named John Fox, and he left. The band was just in a state of disarray, and actually they got dropped from their label, from Island Records. They didn't know what they were going to do. But a mutual friend, Billy Curry, who's in the band, here's everybody in the band, Billy, Warren, Midge, and Chris Cross. Anyway, Billy had a friend, Rusty Egan, and Rusty was working with this guy who he thought might be a good fit for Ultravox, and his name was Mitsouko. Midge is this guy standing here in the middle. I love this photo, by the way. I love this cover. I love everything about this album. But anyway, Midge and Rusty were working on tunes for another band called Visage. Anyway, Billy brought Midge to the band and introduced him. Warren Kahn was knocked out, thought he was a great fit. He wanted someone who was a multi-instrumentalist and a good singer, and Midge was all that and more. In fact, in the interim, before they recorded this album, after Midge had joined, they had to go and work some spare jobs to make money for the recording process. Midge actually went and played guitar for Thin Lizzy for their tour of the United States and Japan. It was in 79 I think it was. So anyway, Warren and Billy had started working on several songs while Midge was out touring, one of which would be the title track, Vienna. And Warren and Billy wanted to make it kind of like an 18th or was it 19th century romantic composer had done this song, so they added strings and whatever. Midge had started to pin in some words for that, and it was a love song about, or it was a love song about an affair that had gone wrong in Vienna, hence the title. Now, funny thing is, when they were going over the songs with the producer Conny Plank, Billy and Warren played back the orchestration, and Midge was like, "This means nothing to me." And Connie goes, "Why don't you sing that?" Bam, the rest is history. That's part of the famous chorus of Vienna. Really quick, the album was recorded in London, but mixed in 2 weeks in Conny Plank's studio in Cologne. Title track, Vienna, changed everything for Ultravox. Funny story about that though. Everybody knows the video and whatever. The video was actually filmed in London with only a few shots really done in Vienna. The song, even though it was so famous and changed everything for Ultravox, only got to number 2. And it stayed there for weeks and weeks and weeks. But it never got to number 1. Why? Because John Lennon and his song Woman, and then after that, the novelty song, Shut Up at Your Face, kept them off the top of the charts. However, in 2012, because it was such a beloved song and they had such a fight trying to get to number 1, the official chart company did give an honorary number 1 to the single Vienna. And funnily enough, in 2014, the whole United Kingdom voted Ultravox's Vienna as the number 1 song of the 80s. That's right, the best song. Didn't make it to number 1, but it became number 1 in everyone's hearts, and that's what counts. Changed everything for the band. Funnily enough, when the album first came out, had kind of mixed reviews. The Melody Maker said, overall, Ultravox deserves success, and this should do the trick. And guess what? It did. But on the other side of the Atlantic, Robert Christgau, the grumpy New York music editor, called this dance music for locked pelvises. Whatever. They ended up coming out on top. One of my all-time favorite bands, one of my all-time favorite albums of the 80s. Mitsouko's first album with the band changed everything. Great song. If you don't know this, you need to check this out. And hey, you might as well check out Visage as long as you're at it. While you're at it, I should say. They mixed the album in Cologne with Conny Plank. Conny Plank is a famous German producer who had worked with Can, Cluster, Eno, produced Kraftwerk, and several bands throughout the 80s. Now, a weird little thing, maybe there's a curse of Conny Plank, because he also produced this next band and their biggest single, Ritamitsuko with Marcia Baya, or a lot of people in the States say Marcia Bala. Anyway, this single, just like Ultravox in a way, never got to #1, but it was the band's biggest single off of their debut album, and it became one of the biggest selling singles in France. Really quick, Marcia Baya, what is that? Actually, the song was written for Marcia Moretto, who was a choreographer who worked with Ritamitsuko in their early days touring. Sadly, she died at a very early age, in the early 30s, from breast cancer. But this song was written and dedicated, or written for her, and huge. Now, obviously, it got to #2 in France. It got to number 27 in the club charts in America. The video helped propel this band to worldwide stardom as well. And in the video, which this is in the early 80s, you see some costumes. There were plenty of important people, or a handful I should say, working on this video who would go on to be big superstars themselves. One of the costumers, or a few of the costumers that worked with the band in the video and afterwards as well, was Terry Mugler and Jean-Paul Gaultier. If you watch the video, check out what Catherine is wearing, and you'll notice the pointy boob bustier she was wearing before Madonna did. Anyway, great French band, Ritamitsuko. Oh, one other thing. Because this got so big, people started getting confused, calling her Rita. Where is Rita? Where is Rita? Well, the band wanted everybody to realize Ritamitsuko is not a person, it's a band. This would be the last single the band put out under Ritamitsuko. From here on out, after this single, they were Les Ritamitsuko. Now, Conny Plank produced Ultravox, produced Ritamitsuko, and he also produced these guys, Eurythmics, and this is their debut album, In the Garden. Conny Plank had also worked with Eurythmics in their previous band, well, Dave and Annie's previous band called The Tourist, who did have some hits as well. Sadly though, no hits on this record. It is their debut, and they did record it in Germany at Conny's studio. They have different members of Can and DAF on this album, as well as another special guest I'll get to in just a minute. They only released 2 singles. This album didn't really do much in the charts, but it was their pioneering album, trying to get their sound together. They had 2 singles, Never Gonna Cry Again and Belinda. I love Belinda. Great single. It's actually kind of shocking for Eurythmics because of the amount of guitar in it. If you don't know that song, listen to that song. The other single, Never Gonna Cry Again, is important. Why? It's the only song, or one of the few songs, I think it's the only song actually, that Annie Lennox has a flute solo in it. In case you didn't know it, Annie Lennox studied flute at the Royal College of Music when she was in college. And it is one of the few times that Annie Lennox is recorded actually even playing flute. Who was that other special guest I was talking about? There's a guy from New York City, and his name is Clem Burke. Conny Plank had nothing to do with them, but Clem Burke played drums with Eurythmics, and he was also a member of these dudes. This is Blondie, and this is their debut album. And I have to say, this copy here I have in the shop is fantastic. It's virtually brand new. You can see the shrink, the condition is awesome. Anyway, I believe it was Trouser Press had said that Trouser Press was an old music magazine from the 70s, that this was actually Blondie's best album ever. Came out in 1977. And the other avant-garde kind of punky people like Television and Talking Heads didn't really like Blondie because they thought they were too girly. And a lot of critics said they were very poppy, kind of taking the girl group sound from the 60s and mixing it in perfectly with pop and a little bit of the punky edginess on this album. Of course, some critics said you could have it both ways on this album. The pretty lightweight pop, and also a little bit risque of the darker side, which it is if you listen to some of the songs on here. In fact, The debut single off this was Ex Offender, originally entitled Sex Offender, but of course radios wouldn't play it, so Blondie had to change the name. The album also has a couple other great singles on it. In the Flesh, fantastic songs, one of my all-time favorites, and Rip Her to Shreds. This album by Rolling Stone calls it one of the 500 greatest of all times, and when it was released, Rolling Stone actually said it was peppy but rough pop and distanced, artless avant rock. What the heck is avant rock? Anyway, the band first took off in the UK because of this, and then later took off in the States. And we all know the story with Blondie, because even though they weren't punky enough to be a punk, they ended up having worldwide fame, bigger than probably the other New York City art wank punk bands. Laughed all the way to the bank. By the way, Mr. Clem Burke is this guy right here. And there we have it, guys. All the albums tied together by Conny Plank, or at least people Conny worked with. Clem Burke played drums on Eurythmics, produced by Conny Plank. Conny Plank produced Ritamitsuko, their debut album, and this single, Marcia Baya, which only got to #2, just like these guys, Ultravox and Vienna, their biggest album, their biggest single, which also only got to #2 and was produced by Conny Plank. If you see anything on the video you liked, just give me a message, let me know. I'll hold it for you if you want to buy it or not, or have questions about it, get in touch. Also, here on Instagram, that is. Also, you can write me an email anytime, noisyrecordsmx@hotmail.com. Love to hear from you, your pointers. If you want me to talk about some bands or feature some albums, I will get on it for you. Thanks again, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Stay safe, keep on rocking, and see you next time.